the concern at some point about anybody who goes through a great deal of turmoil, whether that's a physical threat, an emotional threat, psychological threat, whatever these things are, it arrests development. Okay, when this, and I'm thinking about children for the most part. I believe it to be true for everybody, but for children in particular, nobody, very few people, educational institutions, schools, do not address what are the lingering and finally, frequently, determining things that remain. One example that comes to mind, for instance, is that all people, exceptions are there to be sure, but let's change that to most people emerge eventually from these kinds of war experiences, if we're talking about war as the catalyst to arrested development, takes the form of hoarding. Okay? People like me hoard. They're all hoarders, whether it is something we know about these people or not. I just very recently, my sister turned 80 a week ago, and she is just a little bit older than I, and I just discovered that she hoards boxes. Can you believe that? I mean, there's absolutely no, on the surface of that, there is no reason for that. And the moment the box is empty, it disappears. And she has them stacked in her garage. And I keep asking her, what do you have all these boxes for? Oh, just ignore them. You never know. I may need them for something. So it takes, and I think as Pam perhaps told you, and as the I Am From poem, if you ever saw that, and it isn't in the book right now, but it will be, I hoard chocolate. I hoard chocolate because my parents and other grown-ups, when I was perhaps 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, in that whole entire period, my parents promised me, oh, when the war is over, we'll have chocolate. And I would say, what is chocolate? I've never seen. Oh, yes, you have. Oh, no, I have not. Oh, yes, you have. You like it. Well, I know nothing about it. I've never seen chocolate. I want chocolate. How come we don't have chocolate? And the end of that story is that the moment the war was over, and we're talking a good 5 years later, I demanded my chocolate. And then it was a bit of a shock, well, not yet, it'll come. And I knew there was white chocolate and milk chocolate and dark chocolate, and I would love each and every one of those, okay. And when it finally did come, I ate a good bit of it. And for some reason, and I really don't have a good explanation for this, but I always have a drawer in the kitchen, that's a chocolate drawer, and don't go there. Other people in the house, granddaughters, daughters, obviously my daughters know about this. By now my grandkids know about this too. And they have been told by their mothers, don't go into Graham's drawer. Don't go after the chocolate. And it's not that they can't have it, but they just cannot help themselves. For some reason, I have to be in control of that. And it's absurd. I'd be the first one to say this is total baloney. I can go to the store and get more. Oh no, leave my drawer alone. So, you have some absurd behavior that emerges and that really stays with you. And as I said, I'm very aware. the census is taken every 10 years, presumably. So the census would have been taken in 1940, right? Germany invaded the Low Countries in May of 1940, as a matter of fact, on May 10th. So the information about the census was in by that time, which of course was unfortunate, because that gave the occupying enemy forces access to handy-dandy lists of location, people's addresses and how many members in the family, knew exactly where to find whomever they might be looking for. We had somehow managed to get passage or to get tickets for a ship that was to leave the harbor of Amsterdam that would sail to England. And how we had managed to get tickets, or I have absolutely no clue. No clue. And thinking about that, I wondered why I never asked my dad about that. But at any rate, I remember that we were bundled up, meaning that we wore probably 4 layers of clothes, because there was nothing that we could take with us except physically what we in fact had on our bodies, because I don't remember a lot of suitcases. Perhaps there were some suitcases, but anyway. And we had taken a taxi to the harbor, which was a huge adventure as far as my sister, and I were concerned. And then when we got to the harbor, we were supposed to meet my grandmother there. This was my mother's mother. And she was not there at the appointed time, appointed place. So my mother got a little hysterical, because let's say agitated, and told my father, "This is ridiculous, why isn't she here? You told me that you had gone to her house and you talked with her and she understood and she was going to be here." She wasn't. Waited a little bit, and it got later, and she says, "This is out of the question. She's got to come. You better go get her." So I remember that he went in a taxi, crossed town, presumably to get her, and he came back sometime later. Agitation growing by this time, because obviously the ship had to load and get out of the harbor on time, and that probably had more to do with the tide for a ship to get out, than anything else. I have no idea. So anyhow, he came back, and my grandmother was not with him. So I remember my mother saying, "Well, where is she? Where is she? I can't go without her. Why didn't you bring her? You should have dragged her. You should have done whatever you should have done. But you should have brought her. We can't go. I cannot leave her behind. I can't do that." Well, the net result was that we turned around and we went home. We did not leave. And then 2 days later, 3 days later, we heard that the ship had in fact left the harbor, had in fact managed to get into the English Channel, ran onto a bunch of mines and exploded, and there were no survivors. There is a whole series of curtailments that occurred, and those curtailments start with innocent little things. Jews cannot sit on a public park bench. Okay? It's a little announcement. So there is a little placard is placed on the park benches throughout the city, throughout the world for that matter, forbidden for Jews. And from there, the next thing may be Jews may not use public transportation. So the streetcar will have a little board, little placard, little thing hanging there, a little sign posted, forbidden for Jews. And then that increases little by little, because if anything, the Germans are, I think as a nation, they're extremely systematic, and that is undoubtedly evidenced in probably one of the greatest cultures of all time. Certainly for Western civilization, the leader in all things, leader in science, leader in philosophy, leader in literature, leader in music. Is there anybody better? I mean, that's not to say that other countries don't have great this or that. Okay, in Italy we have great opera. All right, we have all kinds of great things in great countries, no doubt. But all of it, each of those in one country, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And as a by the way, also, the more difficult to comprehend why any of this was necessary. That whole war thing, when you have everything and you control everything, the riches of culture now is what I'm talking about, the riches of science, the riches of invention. Why? But that's perhaps, it's perhaps a different question. Because in being super systematic, it's little by little, right? People get used to not having Jews sit on park benches. The Jews got used to it too. And then it's a little bit more. And then pretty soon, think Wisconsin and the labor parties, all right? Jews are no longer allowed to have government jobs. They can no longer teach at universities. Layoffs all over the place. All right, so all these little steps, and it's just like it's like any fisherman knows when you take a seining net. You tie it on one on either end, and then you just start to drag it and drag it and drag it, and all the fish are inside, and then it closes, and then here we have all the fish inside the net. And that's exactly what happened to the Jews. And then slowly, obviously not slowly, but I would think simultaneously, the resistance workers, anybody who opposed the occupying forces, were included. Jews by this time are recognized as the kind of vermin, the kind of pests, the kind of rodents depicted on large posters throughout the city, so that at no time would a person forget just how damned and awful a Jew is and how grotesque they look. I mean, look at their noses. You know right away that these are no good. How could they be? So in being depicted in that way, the population gets very used to it. And now we're even to the point, if we can demonstrate or we know you to be a Jew lover, if you have Jewish friends, and by this time already a Jew could not be a shopkeeper, and all Jewish shops had to be closed and had to disappear, or they were just simply confiscated. So, the net just closes and closes and closes and closes until systematically Jews in roundups were shipped off, trained off. They were not in a ship. They were trained off. Why don't we have a word called trained off when we have shipped off? Never mind. To various concentration camps. And concentration camps became death camps, although in each of the camps, thousands of people died. Not each of these camps have gas chambers. Okay? There were many different ways of dying, and the gas chamber was simply an invention where a greater number of people could be annihilated, could be gotten rid of faster. So that was simply progressive. Now that we are so successful, rounding them up and transporting them to a gathering place, well, what are you going to do with them when we get there? I'm going to get rid of them. So that invention of Zyklon B, or whatever the gas was called, became extremely efficient. Extremely efficient. So life changed. You can't do these things. You can't do this. You can't do that. How did life change? Life changed because increasingly the Germans needed more for the war effort, and the local population, however Christian and wonderful they might have been, certainly are potential resistance workers. So we need to rob them. We need to be sure that they have no contact with the outside world. So therefore, all radios are confiscated house to house. We need to be sure that they don't have any weapons. So therefore, all implements of iron or metal need to be confiscated. We need to be sure that they have no transportation. And this is before the car. Before the car was, not before it was invented, but certainly before the car had found Europe in the kind of prominence that it has since then. People in the Netherlands ride bicycles, so therefore we need to confiscate their bicycles. And a little bit later, since this is increased each and every year, things get worse. You may remember that Germany got split between a Western Front and an Eastern Front. And an Eastern Front, it was awfully cold, and an Eastern Front, they really suffered. They lost a lot of Germans, with the result that they then had to come house to house and take blankets from people. So by the time you're stripped, every household now, irrespective of whether you're Jew lovers or not, we're long since past that. We've gotten rid of those by then as well. Because you could be a Jew lover because in a roundup, Germans like to have spectators, so that people could observe how the scum of the world was removed, taken care of. And we as kids, at gunpoint, would stand there so that we could watch how families were dragged out of their houses and pushed into a truck. It was an open truck at the top with benches, and the people would sit on those benches, and then more and more people would be pushed in there until the truck was really full. And then they like to have their spectators around there, as I said, at gunpoint. And then if you dare to wave at somebody, we're talking about people in your own neighborhood, so the likelihood that you would know people, if you waved at them or smiled at them, then you were a Jew lover, and then you go on the truck with them. If you're not shot right on the spot, because being a Jew lover is just about as bad as being a Jew. So that's how life changed. Okay, just incrementally, and with that, eventually we reach 1944, which is probably the worst winter in all of Europe. My mother's situation became more and more difficult because, again, systematically, first the Jews go that are simply Jews. And how do you know you're a Jew? If you have 4 grandparents or 4 parents or 4 grandparents that are Jews, that's going to make you a Jew. So you're out. Okay? And then a little bit later, when all those people, and even those people, first of all, men and women went first. And then if men and women had children, then women and children went. And after that, it is just ever so slowly, strictly according to the census, you know. Then, if you had a mixed marriage, for a while, you were okay. And then that was no longer okay. But if you had a mixed marriage and children, you were okay until that was no longer okay. And then, of course, there is that whole point where all Jews, by virtue of their own parentage, whether they were in mixed marriage or not, had to wear the yellow Star of David. All right, and that had to be prominently displaced inside and outside the house at all time. So, if you could still go outside, you had to have an ID card. You could be stopped at any time by any German, and then they immediately would know whether your number literally had come up or not. Not that you were given a number, but did you belong to the group that is currently being herded and currently being deported to the concentration camps of Eastern Europe, of Poland, Austria, Germany, predominantly. So it is a systematic removal of the Jewish population. And I don't know whether we had, my sister and I had to wear stars or not. I have a feeling that we did not and that we didn't. Okay? First of all, the moment you put a star over your heart, you have acknowledged or identified yourself as a Jew. And my mother had several sweaters and jackets where she had a Jew, and she got to the point where she would only wear things with lapels so that the star could be under the lapel, and she would always, have the lapels open. And then should there be a situation where she was asked for her ID, all right, then she could sort of fold the lapels across her chest and be legal. Okay. She also carried two IDs because everybody had to have an identity card. And the identity card, if you had a Jew, had a great big black J stamped on the middle of the face page like a passport, just a big J on it. But there was also, much later, there was a story in the book called This Is the Day. I don't know whether you had a chance to read it or not. Anyhow, that Jewish women in a mixed marriage could become exempt from deportation if they had been sterilized. Okay? And to achieve that exempt status, you would get an ID card with a red J on it. So my mother had two ID cards, black J, a red J. So because there were so many house-to-house roundups where people were simply, they stormed into the house with gun butts, just opening the doors, and they made a lot of noise. Living in the city, lots of stairs, coming up the stairs to announce their arrival, always screaming, always shouting, to be ready that they were coming for those dirty Jews that they knew lived there. And you better come out, your game is up, your turn has come, and here we are, and there is no time to pack your stuff or do anything, get ready. You know, they threw people down the stairs. I mean, they just always seem to be very loud and very much in a hurry. And there are lots of stories that surround these things were called razzias. Okay, a razzia is a roundup of Jews in order to deport them. We also function as couriers. And as couriers, again, remember, radios were gone, desperate need for news in the outside world. Sometimes the Allied airplanes on their way, flying over the Netherlands, on their way to Germany to bomb the big industrial cities in Germany, flying overhead, then of course there were huge searchlights, you know, that would light up the sky at night, because there were night bombing raids. You may remember that from the history. And obviously they would end up in these searchlights, and obviously anti-aircraft, you know, weaponry would go after these planes, and many of them were brought down. So in turn, that meant that we had to look for shrapnel. We collected shrapnel, you know, from these exploding aircraft, munitions, what have you. This was a big pastime because you had a collection and you put the collection in a shoebox. 5 o'clock in the morning, no matter what the curfew was, 5 o'clock in the morning, particularly this time of year, we'd be out there getting the shrapnel because we could trade them in school. And sometimes I'd have shrapnel that still had the copper, some of them had copper in it. And if I had copper, boy, you know, those were treasured pieces. They were way better than ordinary shrapnel. So that was a major activity, kept us very busy. Sometimes those airplanes would drop leaflets, all right, over the city. And then it would be a question of gathering those leaflets, and the resistance workers, those illegal radios, listening to the BBC to get information about Allied and Russian too, about progress that was being made. Those pamphlets were folded in very small strips, and they were hidden in Band-Aid wrappers. And they were given to us kids, and we as couriers distributed that information to a given set of people. That is, people who were known to be, okay, on the right side, not Nazi sympathizers. There was a decided distinction very rapidly that was made between those. 5% of the Dutch population sympathized with Hitler. Okay, 5%. That 5% became among the most dangerous because as they too experienced the hardships as they began to occur as the war progressed, you know, they could make money by finding Jews in hiding and reporting them. You know, they received so much ahead. So there was an enemy within as well, you know, in addition to the people in uniform. So it was dangerous business to be couriers, but it was a great job for kids, particularly, I would say, when kids were, by the time they were 10, 11 years old, they were responsible enough that they pretty much knew what they were doing. They knew the lay of the land, they knew the streets, they knew where to go, they knew where people lived, and they could deliver information, which was so important for people to know what was going on elsewhere. You know, was somebody coming to help? We had normal schooling, give or take. I mean, normal at that time includes air raids, okay, and time out for the whole school to go into shelters until it is over. And then the alarm would sound, and people would return to class. So we had those ongoing day and night. And they alone were kind of frightening, because you can hear bombs and you hear explosions and you hear airplanes overhead, and the war was officially over at 8 o'clock in the morning on May 5th of 1945. And the capitulation of the Germans was known by the BBC the night before. On May 4th, against the curfew, we went outside. And those who knew how to whistle tunes on their fingers did so. It had to be really loud. And those were sort of national songs, the kind of patriotic, patriotic songs that we whistled on our fingers. And we flooded the streets. But it was not official until the following morning, 8 o'clock. So the Germans came in their cars and trucks and began to fire on people, but mostly in the air. I would have to say that lots of stray bullets hit people, but I can't say they were aiming at or firing at the people. So it was after curfew, so that quote and unquote was fair. Everybody knew you were not supposed to be on the street after 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and here it was 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and you were on the street, and it was springtime, it was May, it was light, outside, so we were outside. So that scattered us back inside. So that's how I knew war was over. But you have to wait till 8 o'clock next morning. And 8 o'clock next morning, or whatever time, the Canadian troops came into the city, because it is the Canadians who, quote and unquote, liberated Amsterdam. And I was duly delivered to our doorstep in our street, and he took her home. So I do not remember what my mother said to me or did to me. I have a feeling that she just kind of shrugged, as if, I want to say almost as if she had given up on being able to control my activities once I left the house anyway, because this had been happening obviously over a number of years, when I had to be outside scrounging the neighborhood to find out what was going on, who was being picked up, what kind of roundup was being organized, where were the German trucks, read the Nazi activity on the streets, talk to my friends what they knew, steal coal, steal food, go into the houses of Jewish people who had been who had vacated their homes in order to plunder them, in order to strip them of all things made of wood, such as the doors on kitchen cabinets, such as windowsills, such as anything. I can walk into a house and tell you what I can take and how long it would take me to get the stuff out of there. Because we had to have, looking at particularly 1944, when things became so difficult, sometimes we could get frozen sugar beets. And sugar beets are about this big around, and when they're solidly frozen, you cannot eat them. You can only eat them if you can split them, and preferably if you can get them in small enough pieces and cook them. But you have no gas and you have no electricity, so you have nothing to cook them on. So what we needed to have, and what we did have, is like a 3-pound coffee can. When you take the lid off and you poke holes in the lid, and you take the lids off on both ends, and take these lids and use them as a roster, okay, with holes in it. Yes, you put the can down, and now it has holes underneath and some holes in the side, so it can suck up air of this, having used the lid inside. Then you can fill the rest of the can with pieces of wood if the wood is no longer than this. Yes? Well, you live in the city. You have no wood. Where's the wood going to come from? Well, they just took those blankety-blank Jews out of that house. Penetrate, be quick. All right? You have very small tools and you're not very big. Go to work, strip the wood, bring it back. You live upstairs, you have a balcony, so you sit there with a screwdriver and a hammer and you split wood until you get the pieces small enough to fit in the can, and in the can, on top of the can, is the pot with the frozen sugar beets. Bring that to a boil. God help you, you want to know how long that takes? Anyway, suck on those, eat those, because it has food value. Okay. So, given those circumstances, given the mother whose kids are out there doing God knows what, okay, who has to thank her survival and her life to the fact that I could do these things and that we could do these things. This kid shows up in the middle of the night. A parent brings her home. She is a runaway from this farm 200 miles away. I don't think I want to know how she got back. Okay? So that was that kind of resignation that I remember. We left in January. And so I went with them since I had graduated. And I held my mother to her word. And we went in the first available boat after the number came up. And the first available boat was a cargo ship that had just dumped its good or unloaded its goods in Rotterdam. And it was returning empty. And it had room for 5 passengers. We were 3 of those 5 passengers, and the crossing to the United States, to the great port of Mobile, Alabama, would take 9 to 11 days. We got left in January. We got caught in a hurricane. And the 11 days turned into 21 because we were constantly running away from these incredible storms. We had no cargo, so we were light, high on the water. And the only thing we had to eat were pineapple, canned pineapple, and crackers because they ran out of food. So then we arrived late in Mobile. It was Mardi Gras time in New Orleans, and that was my first experience in America. And I was totally astonished, bewildered, taken aback, because I had literally set foot on shore when black people got off the sidewalk for me. And I could not understand since when would anybody get off the sidewalk for me. First of all, I saw myself as a kid. I had barely, just minimally turned 17 because I graduated at age 16, and then my birthday is on the 3rd of January, so I had just turned 17. I just could not believe it. And I knew that I had to go to the bathroom, and I went to the bathroom. First, I had a terrible time finding one in some drugstore type thing. And then I wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom because a black person kept telling me no, and I couldn't understand a word of that English that I was hearing. And there was something about not being allowed to use the bathroom. She shoved me out of the door, but she didn't really touch me either. I don't quite know how she did that. I think it was her bulk in the doorway that was kind of shooing me out of there. And then somebody had to show me that I had to go to a different bathroom for whites only. And I was just beside myself with the nonsense of it all. You have to understand, I'd never seen a black person in my life. The Netherlands is a very white country, or at least it was a very white country. So, anyhow, such my introduction to America. This is something that we have never talked about and didn't talk about that for you. Shall I read it to you?
Sure.
I was 7 years old and living in Amsterdam when the Germans invaded the Netherlands. My mother managed 2 prominent hotels and wrote and published children's books on the side. My sister and I would race home from school to hear the latest chapter. We went to the same Montessori school which Anne Frank attended. After the Germans came, our lives were changed forever. My mother was Jewish, my father Catholic. We spent the war years hiding my mother, terrified she would be taken in one of those razzias or roundups of Jews. I was constantly told, don't talk, don't tell. I was a kind of what do we call a person? I was full of it. You know, as a youngster, I've always been full of it, but now we use different 4-letter words to tell people what I'm full of, okay? But the greatest danger for my mother was that I would talk. That I would be altogether too too eager to tell people about the goings on, you know, altogether. And the first and the last thing that I always heard before going to school, before going anywhere, was don't tell, don't talk. You may not tell, do not tell anybody who we are, where we live, that I am here. Don't talk about it. No matter what you do, don't tell, don't talk. So that became a major begin to tell you the things I saw and the things we had to do to survive. People just do what they have to do. The rest of the kids, the rest of the kids become blind. That means they don't see you. And if they don't see you, they can bump into you or elbow you to the ground. Oh, I didn't see you. And you can't be held responsible for that which you cannot see. And this poor Nazi boy spent a lot of time on the ground. His life was miserable. And finally, the teacher had to step in and tell the kids that they were no longer allowed to be blind. Anyhow, it's a good story. Kids know. Even though this boy was just doing what his parents, you know, what was he? Probably in 5th grade, 6th grade, you know. He was becoming to be, you know, a young man in some ways. He needed to stand up and salute Hitler, you know. Parents thought it would be good for him. Not in that school, I didn't. Not in that classroom. Something that has remained with me as something that I must address and that is that children were obviously rounded up with their families and ended up in concentration camps. That I stood there at the point of a gun and watched my friends loaded onto trucks where I, at gunpoint, was unable to even acknowledge that I knew them. So I can't wave goodbye, could not smile at them. And that I have found to be crossing the line, okay, my greatest betrayal. I should have helped. I should have fixed. But I also knew, obviously, what would happen to me. If you recognize these children, you are obviously a Jew lover, and you will join them on that truck. Anyhow, that image stayed with me. And in the case of the Holocaust, and why the Holocaust continues to be important, because we are talking about 3 generations. Now, 3 generations of a people are removed and have stripped, as a by the way, okay, the heart out of Western civilization. Germany, in that sense, destroyed itself. And again, the largest, best, most beautiful, culturally, okay, renowned center of Western culture. Hands down. Unforgivable, unacceptable, to be sure, right? So, having said all that, the fact that children who disappeared, and specifically 173 children from that Montessori school, okay, that this should happen. They certainly had no grave. They went up in smoke. There is certainly no acknowledgement anywhere that they ever existed. I have felt compelled to attempt to get a plaque or to get something, okay, to acknowledge the fact that once upon a time there were children here that were not allowed to live. And I went to that Montessori school and I said, you are the first Montessori school and you must help me get a plaque to honor or acknowledge those children. The Germans had been so successful, and whatever the percentage factor of success was, whether that was Poland or whether that was the what was called, the solution to the Jewish problem, the solution was nearly complete, and their success by every standard known to man, their success rate was extremely high. If you can remove 95% of the population, then your success rate is high. The worst was at the very end, because the final roundup was to occur on a Monday morning, where people were to report. And that was to be, and by this time, obviously, Russians and Allied forces were getting ever closer. We're talking about November of 1944. We were more worried about that roundup than any, because there was a different way that was going to be executed. Because it was to be the last one, and all the children, including my sister and me, were to be a part of this, and there was absolute no escape. The net did not have any holes in it, blah, 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 and we were frantic. It was late November, and we had a kind of a bay window on the second floor of our house, and I was sitting in this bay window. I could look way down the street, and it was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday, And I screamed at my mother, my sister, come look, there are airplanes, they're flying right down the street, come look. And by that time it was already too late. The airplanes are flying, in fact, between the houses and turned the corner. And the next thing we knew, there were bombs dropping everywhere. And we ran downstairs for protection. My sister stayed upstairs to open the windows and throw a bunch of coats down the stairs, and bombs just flew all around us. And when the airplanes had unloaded their bombs, they came back and machine gunned everybody who was running down the streets because of the German headquarters, okay? The target was the German headquarters, and the German headquarters were 200 yards away from our house. They missed a bunch of bombs. The school was damaged in that bombing, and a whole bunch of houses around us, okay, ended up being bombed because the British who were delivering these bombs were doing something that was an unknown. They used a type of, they weren't Spitfires, which were the hunters in the sky, so to speak, but a similar airplane, a little bit heavier, but not an airplane that could carry bombs, okay, that had the capability of carrying bombs, because they had to be swift, lightweight, small enough to fly through a street. They did it on a Sunday. All this came out later, because there would be fewer people on the street and schools would not be in session. And they dive bombed. They had stripped the bombs to the wings because they were not bomb-carrying aircraft. They were fighter planes. That's what they were called. They were fighter planes that protect, the larger airplanes. And they protect them from air attacks because they're slower. The ones are heavily loaded with bombs. So anyhow, these were small planes. I know what they're called, and I can't come up with the name right now. Anyhow, their bombs were strapped to the wings, and they dive bombed, as fighter planes would, and hit the two schools that had been commandeered by the Nazis for their headquarters. And when the bombing, was a lot of destruction, because it was so very close. And then, as the bombing stopped and the airplanes left, we saw white things fluttering in the air. A bunch of dust because so many buildings were hit, so there was a lot of debris and dust everywhere. And there were pamphlets floating, and my mother, this is the closest she had been to the street in a long time, and she says, go outside and get one of these pamphlets. And I said, I'm not going outside. This is way too scary. Well, my sister, being far braver than I, took me with her. We went on the street and we got a pamphlet and we brought him to her quickly. And because here, she says, these are not pamphlets from the Allied forces. These are documents from hitting these two headquarters. And these were all the documents that would enable them to hold that final roundup the following day of all the people not already taken, deported. And then she sent us back on the street and says, you better go take a look around. So my sister and I did. And, there were a lot of fires everywhere. I mean, after a bombing, the likelihood of fire is huge. And the whole 200 yards, 15-hour house and headquarters, where all these Germans were doing whatever Germans do in headquarters, and they had run out that building, and that's what we heard, that these fighter planes had come back and used machine gun fire, just go to, just there were bodies. The whole street was strewn with bodies. So we went body to body, went through their pockets and see what they had was worthwhile, something we could sell, something we could use. There was a dentist's house, and he had been celebrating an anniversary of some kind, and they were all dead. And all of his dentist tools were on the sidewalk, and we took those too. My sister said they might be good for something. I had no clue. So I just picked them up. And so we did a treasure hunt through those Germans' pockets and brought those treasures home. But there was no Monday morning reporting roundup. And that was the last big one. And we were saved.